Welcome, listener. Today, we explore a narrative that intertwines political conflict, media frenzy, and a comedian who defied expectations by challenging both sides of the aisle. Our journey begins in Washington, D.C., yet, like the nation it represents, it unfolds across countless viewpoints, fears, and aspirations that have come to define the modern presidency. I invite you to step back from the daily noise and see how a single administration sparked perpetual debate, how the media fueled that debate, and how a well-known satirist, Jon Stewart, offered an unorthodox perspective that left many applauding, while others bristled in surprise. Imagine the barrage of news stories that greeted viewers almost every day during the Trump presidency. Words like unprecedented, authoritarian, and existential crisis echoing in cable broadcasts, blog posts, and Twitter threads. For supporters of Donald Trump, such words felt like incessant cries of wolf, a press overreaction painting every move in dire colors. For his detractors, these warnings seemed not only justified, but urgent. There was talk of Friday night, massacres and government purges whenever key officials were dismissed, and indignation soared each time the White House invoked executive authority in a way that jarred the political establishment. Yet here was Jon Stewart, best known as a sharp-tongued critic of conservative policies, suddenly pointing out something unusual. Many of these actions, condemned as un-American or undemocratic, were technically within the scope of presidential power. He wasn't praising the morality of those moves, nor was he endorsing the grandstanding style that often accompanied them. Rather, he asked why a constitutional system would allow such actions in the first place if they were so objectionable. He questioned whether the focus on Trump's personal style overshadowed a bigger problem, a set of legal levers that any president, Republican or Democrat, could pull. Stewart's comments left some of his longtime admirers unsettled. They had grown used to his punchy monologues dissecting conservative rhetoric, and in their eyes, Donald Trump was an emblem of that very rhetoric taken to an extreme. Hearing Stewart direct attention away from Trump's faults and toward systemic failings felt to them like a betrayal. Meanwhile, some on the right seized this moment, heralding Stewart's critiques as vindication for their belief that media coverage and establishment politics were biased. In truth, Stewart was neither capitulating to Trump's worldview nor dismissing valid concerns. He was holding up a mirror to the Constitution, to federal statutes, and to the political culture that had evolved under many administrations. Consider the president's power to grant pardons. It is among the broadest powers in the Constitution. Traditionally, the pardon was viewed as an instrument of mercy, a means to correct judicial errors or mitigate overly harsh penalties. Yet it has also been employed in controversial ways, from Gerald Ford's decision to pardon Richard Nixon after Watergate to Bill Clinton's slew of last-minute pardons involving wealthy donors. Barack Obama issued numerous commutations, some of which critics charged were more about political messaging than justice. Then came Trump, whose pardons often appeared to favor friends, political allies, and individuals who showed him personal loyalty. Political opponents insisted this was an affront to democracy, a sign of creeping monarchism. The real question, as Stewart pointed out, is whether we are willing to accept a framework that lets any president exercise near-limitless grace. The Constitution provided for this mechanism with little restriction, and unless we decide to amend, those powers, a future president, regardless of ideology, could do exactly what Trump did. Perhaps even more provocative was Trump's firing of multiple inspectors general, the officials tasked with investigating mismanagement, fraud, and abuse within government agencies. When a president removes these watchdogs, many interpret it as an attack on transparency, a brazen attempt to eliminate oversight. But as Title V of the U.S. Code spells out, the president holds the authority to remove an inspector general, provided Congress is notified. Legal scholars acknowledge that this statutory requirement is weaker than many realize. The president need only give a reason, and it can be as vague as loss of confidence. Critics denounced Trump's firings as an unprecedented purge or a Friday night massacre, phrases that conjured images of past abuses like Nixon's dismissal of the special prosecutor during Watergate. Yet there remained a nagging fact. If removing inspectors general is so dangerous, then why is it legally permissible in the first place? Stewart used this point to remind everyone that outrage against a single president may solve nothing if the system itself remains intact. The public discourse was further tangled by a media ecosystem that thrives on alarm and spectacle. In an age of 24-hour news cycles, social media storms, and virally shared videos, every twist in the Trump presidency could become a top story within minutes. Each new directive, tweet, or personnel change was framed as a dramatic moment in a national epic. Pundits competed to label these episodes. Some called it the slow erosion of democracy. Others said it was a defensive president fighting back against entrenched bureaucracy. Viewers, meanwhile, were left struggling to parse out how much of each situation was business-as-usual politics and how much was genuinely alarming. Stewart, who had spent years lampooning media excess on The Daily Show, felt that constant cries of crisis could eventually numb the public to actual threats. When every minor story is presented as a catastrophe, citizens might fail to recognize when a real constitutional emergency does arrive. Then there was the question of selective outrage. Stewart saw that both Democrats and Republicans tend to support strong executive authority when they hold the Oval Office. Under George W. Bush, Democrats decried sweeping surveillance programs and heightened executive powers granted in the wake of 9/11. When Barack Obama took office, some of those same Democrats defended the administration's expansions of those powers, even as Republicans who once championed a robust presidency reversed course to condemn it. The cycle repeated under Trump, with Democrats returning to their alarm over executive overreach. In such an environment, one can understand Stewart's cynicism about how genuine the cries of tyranny really are. To him, it was as though each party feigns shock at the same powers it was willing to bolster when politically convenient. This contradiction becomes more evident if we look at historical precedents. Abraham Lincoln took extraordinary measures during the Civil War, suspending habeas corpus, for instance, yet is generally revered for preserving the Union. Franklin D. Roosevelt responded to the Great Depression and World War II by amassing unprecedented federal authority. Some hailed him as a decisive leader. Others likened his approach to an imperial presidency. In the wake of the Vietnam War and Watergate, new statutes intended to clamp down on presidential power were introduced, but subsequent administrations found workarounds, and the public mood often shifted back to supporting vigorous executive action during crises. By the time Trump took office, the pendulum of strong presidential authority had been swinging for decades, leaving a robust set of tools at his disposal. When we trace this arc, the recurring question is whether the public and Congress truly want to restrain the presidency. Legislation to strengthen inspectors general or to limit pardons often surfaces when controversies explode in the media, yet it tends to fizzle once attention moves on. Politicians can be reluctant to pass laws curbing powers they may want if their party regains the White House. Meanwhile, voters may feel momentarily outraged, but that outrage often shifts to other concerns or wanes after election cycles. In this pattern, Stewart sees a trap. The system remains effectively unaltered, ensuring that future presidents can operate much the same way Trump did, only perhaps with subtler public messaging. Stewart's role in this conversation is both compelling and paradoxical. He is, after all, a comedian, not a constitutional scholar. Yet his candor allowed him to traverse the usual partisan lines. When he reminded liberals that they had supported expansive executive actions under Obama, or that they barely objected to certain powers if it served their policy goals, he angered a segment of his own fan base. And yet this was consistent with the ethos he had displayed for years, calling out hypocrisy and holding media coverage to account, whether the subject was right-leaning or left-leaning. Think about the climate that fosters such rapid judgments. The outrage economy, as some call it, is fueled by algorithms on social media that reward heightened emotion with more likes, shares, and visibility. Journalists and commentators, driven by job security or corporate profit, can focus on stories that generate heated debate. For an increasingly divided public, the spectacle of a presidential purge is far more compelling than a nuanced legal analysis showing that, yes, Title V indeed does permit the president to remove an inspector general. This is not to dismiss legitimate concerns but to illustrate that over-sensationalizing can obscure vital facts. In a context where people gravitate toward information that reaffirms their beliefs, Jon Stewart's insistence on structural accountability struck many as an unwelcome call for self-reflection rather than an easy condemnation of the person they already opposed. The same pattern emerges with pardons. Casting them as sick or un-American might reflect strong moral indignation, but at day's end, no formal mechanism exists to stop a president from granting them. If we collectively desire a system in which political allies cannot be pardoned, that conversation must happen before the next wave of controversial pardons hits the headlines. Yet in the moment when outrage is at full blast, that structural conversation frequently gets sidelined. Headlines gravitate toward the scandal itself, who got pardoned, why and how it might affect the political fortunes of the president, rather than the fundamental question of whether the Constitution should be amended or if Congress should at least consider accountability measures like mandated transparency or post-pardon reviews. Of course, it would be misleading to claim that everyone who criticized Trump was purely driven by partisan advantage. Some were, no doubt, sincerely convinced that his conduct marked a pivotal threat to democratic norms. They perceived the abruptness of the firings, the acerbic language on social media, and the willingness to push boundaries as evidence that the lines of acceptable conduct had been redrawn. In that sense, Stewart's argument that this is all legal may have sounded like a dodge, a way to minimize the seriousness of those decisions. Yet he was responding to a deeper riddle. If these actions shock you, do you not also wonder why they are permissible at all? If so, the real answer lies in rewriting our laws, not simply condemning the individual who takes advantage of them. Stewart's commentary also dovetails with another persistent debate: the reliance on norms over laws in American governance. Much of what Americans take for granted in politics depends on precedent and courtesy. Inspectors general, for example, are expected to remain until they willingly step down or prove incompetent. Presidents have typically granted them independence out of tradition. Yet when norms are violated, legal statutes may not offer airtight protection. This can lead to confusion and, in the case of Trump's critics, a profound sense of betrayal, that norms once considered sacrosanct could be so casually disregarded. In moments of heightened public emotion, it can be difficult to sustain a dialogue about reform that goes beyond blaming a specific individual. There's a psychological release in channeling outrage at a particular figure, especially one as polarizing and theatrical as Trump. Proposing legislative changes, on the other hand, involves negotiation, public hearings, drafting precise language, and building coalitions. It's a more protracted and less dramatic process. Yet, without that process, the conditions for future standoffs remain firmly in place. It might help to zoom out and consider how easily things could shift if political fortunes reversed. Imagine a populist left-wing president who decided to use executive orders to transform policy overnight, say by reorganizing entire industries in the name of environmental protection. The same people now justifying wide presidential latitude might cry foul. Or picture a centrist president who, under the banner of national security, expands surveillance even further, ignoring established norms on privacy. The lesson is that broad executive power swings both ways. Stewart's call to address the bigger picture is a reminder that short-term gains can become long-term pitfalls if the powers in question are subject to minimal checks. This cyclical pattern has reverberated across eras. Under Nixon, the public discovered the extent to which an administration could subvert the system from within, leading to reforms like the War Powers Resolution, new campaign finance rules, and the creation of inspectors general. Under Reagan, executive authority was tested in foreign affairs, culminating in the Iran-Contra affair. Under Clinton, critics pointed to executive orders and strategic uses of the Justice Department. Under Bush, the post-9/11 environment led to the Patriot Act, indefinite detentions at Guantanamo, and expansion of executive influence in national security. Under Obama, drones and immigration orders drew praise from supporters and alarm from foes. Trump arrived with a penchant for bluntness that magnified each controversy, and each side dug in deeper. Against this chronicle of accumulating powers, Jon Stewart's argument that maybe you should fix the system becomes all the more pointed. If, as a nation, we have continuously allowed the executive branch to expand its orbit, we cannot be wholly astonished when a president uses those powers in surprising or unsettling ways. Indeed, one might argue that this is precisely what you get when you invest so much authority in a single office. Stripped of some of its comedic edge, Stewart's warning is serious. So long as the structures remain the same, every president, regardless of personal style, will have the option to push boundaries. Where do we go from here? The conversation around inspectors general might prompt lawmakers to tighten requirements for removal, perhaps insisting on concrete evidence of misconduct rather than merely loss of confidence. Similarly, Congress could propose new protocols for presidential pardons, such as mandatory disclosure of the advisory process or a prohibition on pardons that present clear conflicts of interest. These moves would spark heated debate. Some would argue they infringe on the president's constitutional prerogative, while others would celebrate them as necessary guardrails. Yet the probability of such measures becoming law remains uncertain. Partisan divisions run deep, and the desire to preserve powers for when one's own party controls the White House often trumps the inclination to limit them. Voters, too, fluctuate between a desire for strong leadership and a fear of unchecked authority. This indecision sustains the status quo, in which broad executive powers exist, overshadowed by norms that are not always enforced. Meanwhile, the media environment is unlikely to cool down. Controversy drives engagement, and engagement drives revenue. As subsequent presidents face challenges, the cycle will likely continue. Headlines proclaiming abuses of power, pundits framing each event as an unprecedented crisis, and political factions taking sides. Unless there is a concerted push to differentiate between legal yet controversial actions and outright illegal ones, much of the public debate may remain fixated on personalities and daily drama rather than systemic flaws. Which brings us back to Jon Stewart, the comedian who, in this scenario, became a kind of unexpected constitutional commentator. His choice to shine a light on the bigger picture is a reminder that satire can be more than entertainment. It can challenge us to reconsider the frameworks we often take for granted. By urging audiences not to demonize one figure to the exclusion of structural analysis, Stewart elevated a crucial point. Democracy is about rules and institutions as much as it is about individuals. Ultimately, the question at hand isn't whether the Trump presidency should be remembered for pushing norms too far, or whether the media or Congress should have responded differently. The deeper question is whether America will learn from this chapter. If we emerge from the experience merely relieved that one administration has ended, without addressing how the system grants enormous latitude to any occupant of the Oval Office, then little has changed. But if these debates about inspectors general pardons and executive overreach spark a genuine legislative or constitutional reassessment, then perhaps the turmoil of the Trump era and Stewart's commentary upon it will serve a purpose. beyond partisan squabbles. For you, the listener, the lesson might be that anger, while it can galvanize attention, must eventually give way to more durable engagement. Outrage alone will never substitute for actionable proposals. Reform requires sustained effort. Citizens pressuring representatives, legislators working across party lines, and a media willing to highlight the nuances rather than chase the most sensational angle. Though these efforts can seem daunting, they are part of the constitutional process the founders envisioned. A self-correcting republic whose people can amend their laws and refine their institutions over time. Thank you for joining this exploration of political power, media dynamics, and one comedian's provocative stance. May it inspire you to look beyond personalities and into the legal and cultural foundations that enable presidents to act as they do. In the end, the enduring drama of American democracy is less about any single individual than it is about how the nation chooses to balance authority and accountability. Only time and the vigilance of its citizens will determine which path is taken.